Thank you, Al, and thank you everyone for coming out today. The work I'm going to be presenting today, as Al mentioned, was completed while I was at Portland State University. After 6 years at Kittelson, I took an extended leave of absence and went to Portland State to work on their research regarding protected bike lanes that many of you have probably read the report for. If not, Google Lessons from the Green Lane after this and take a look at that report. And so this work here was separated from that. It was actually my master's thesis. And so today I'm going to give you a rundown of some of the background behind why we wanted to look at the level of service for protected bike lanes, what other research has been done regarding measuring bicycles' level of service. Then I'll kind of discuss how we did this project, what we found out, and in the end we'll wrap up what it might mean for actual practice, as well as limitations that need to be taken into consideration for both this particular method as well as future research in this area. So the objective of this project was to develop a level of service model for protected bike lanes. We limited ourselves to only segments, just for simplicity's sake in this case. And the model, as you'll see later on, uses only readily available data. The goal is to have a model that can be used quickly and efficiently across multiple facilities. I also had a theory that with a protected bike lane, some of the nuances that matter more for unprotected bike lanes or shared roads don't come into being as much of a factor as they do with protected bike lanes. And you'll see more about how that actually played out later. We wanted to do it using video surveys, and I'll talk more about what that means later. But these video surveys allow us to show a number of different facilities to a group of people at one time, instead of limiting ourselves to an individual study area. Secondarily, we also wanted to get out from this project. If you were to go through and to look at developing, adding more facilities into the model later, or developing a new model for bicycle level of service, taking into account multiple facilities, how might be the best way to go about doing that, as well as just get an idea for how do these protected bike lanes compare to other facilities. So a quick definition here. So protected bike lanes are any type of bike lane that is physically separated from motor vehicle traffic by some type of vertical barrier. So that might be planters, flexible plastic posts, or a row of parked cars. Protected bike lanes are also called cycle tracks, or soon to be called separated bike lanes by FHWA. So there are a few different names out there, but they all refer to the exact same concept. So for measuring user perception of different bike facilities, we use what are called quality of service measures. Level of service is the term most often used by traffic engineers. But there are other measures out there that aren't necessarily called level of service, but they all kind of get at the same thing. They want to measure how well does a street serve a user based on how well the user perceives the service. They also sometimes use the terms comfort, traffic stress, or how safe you might feel. And typically, the different measures out there use an A through F scale, building off of what the highway capacity manual does for auto level of service. But that's not always the case. Sometimes they use a more numeric-based scale. The reason why we want to take a look at measuring the performance of protected bike lanes is generally there's an increased interest in evaluating the performance of facilities from not just auto capacity mode. We're starting to recognize that you can't just build your way out of traffic congestion issues. MAP 21 has guidance saying that FHWA needs to develop more performance measures that aren't necessarily capacity-based. So there's a big motivation, both locally and at the federal level, for more performance measurement. For protected bike lanes, there currently isn't a model based on actual North American data. There's some international work, and then there's some U.S. work that's based on opinion, but nothing based on actual empirical observation. So I'm going to go quickly through some of the previous research that's been done in this area. There's been a number of different bicycle level of service or quality of service models out there. Some of the more commonly used ones are shown here in this table. the HCM method that many of you probably are familiar with. Another one is the Danish model, and there's also the Florida DOT model, which the HCM model builds off of. Federal Highway developed the Bicycle Compatibility Index, the BCI, a while ago. And then there's two somewhat commonly used methods, especially here on the west, level of traffic stress and the San Francisco Bicycle Environmental Quality Index, which are not actually mathematical models per se. They are more index-based. So that's looking at the number of points you might get for different features and adding them up. And you'll see that these models are generally developed in a variety of ways and use a variety of forms, whether it's actual mathematical regression or it's a type of index. And they vary in terms of the number of study sites they consider, generally between 20 and 70, although they don't typically show. Most of these were all developed, the ones that have study sites were developed using video surveys, similar to what I did in my project here. But they don't show, say, all those sites at one single view, and they show, say, a select number, say 10 or 20, to a group and cycle through. Most of the models don't consider protected bike lanes. They're relatively new to the U.S., but the Danish model does. They have had them for a long time in Denmark. Level of traffic stress does consider protected bike lanes, although it is a passing reference to them and it's a little simplified. And the San Francisco index also has a little bit of consideration for them, but it's not explicit. Now, these models all consider a number of different factors. The most common ones out there are based on bicyclists' interaction with motor vehicle traffic. So it's looking at the actual volumes and speeds of motor vehicles and the roadway next to the bicyclist or sharing the lane with the bicyclist. It's looking at what type of facility is there, whether it's a shared road or a bike lane. Usually not much consideration beyond those two. And then the amount of space that's available for sharing, whether there's a 12-foot travel lane with a 5-foot bike lane or a 14-foot lane that's shared, whatever that may be. So, but it's all mostly based on the interaction with motor vehicle traffic. Now I'll talk how we came to the results for this project. So as I mentioned before, we used video survey. To collect the videos, I used a GoPro camera mounted onto a metal bar about the eye level of a typical bicyclist. And I mounted that metal bar onto the handlebar of a bike. And I rode around different protected bike lanes and other facilities in 3 cities, San Francisco, Chicago, and Portland. So the sites we looked at were both protected bike lanes as well as what I call reference sites. So these would be more conventional facilities like standard bike lanes or shared streets or bike boulevards. I included those so we could get an idea for how the protected bike lane clips compared to these other more common infrastructure types. The ultimate videos that we used were about 20 to 30 seconds long. This is enough time to go between 2 intersections without getting into the intersection influence area, since we're looking at segments only. In the end, I ended up evaluating data for 23 different video clips. We started off with 20 and found that 3 of them, after a first showing, were providing redundant information, so we pulled them out and put 3 new clips in for our other showings. In selecting the clips, I tried to get a variety of different types of buffers, whether it's planters, parked cars, or posts, were the 3 we looked at, and different facility types. I wanted to make sure we had conventional bike lanes in addition to protected bike lanes and a variety of other conventional treatments. And we also looked at, I wanted to make sure I had a good number of one-way, or to the extent possible, one-way versus two-way protected bike lanes. I'd heard anecdotally before starting this project that people had different feelings about riding in a one-way bike lane versus a bike lane that allows for two-way travel. So I wanted to get an idea of, does that change how people perceive the level of service they get from the protected bike lane. And finally, I wanted to get a good variety of traffic volumes in there, both from the perspective of being on more busy streets and arterial roads to getting clips that showed multiple cars coming by at the same, in a short period of time, to clips of a road that only showed 1 or 2 cars going by during that period. And here are some examples, screenshots from the protected bike lane sites. So starting up in the upper left, as you look at your screen, it's Multnomah Street in Portland, which is protected by planters in the clips that we use. So it's got a 6 or 7 foot wide buffer with planters right down the middle of it. Moving to the right is Dearborn Street, which is in downtown Chicago, and that's a two-way protected bike lane, and it has parked cars adjacent to it. Although in downtown Chicago, it's sometimes hard to tell when the sections with parked cars were versus just when the sections were with traffic that was congested. But I did make sure that we were looking at the sections with parked cars. And I rode that one in 2 different directions, both with traffic as well as facing oncoming traffic, to get an idea if that had an effect at all on how people felt. Moving down to the left is Southwest Broadway Street in downtown Portland near the Portland State University campus. And it's a one-way protected bike lane on a one-way street, and it was buffered with protected cars. I mean, it's protected with parked cars. Moving to the right is Milwaukee Avenue. It's a radial route connecting Chicago's neighborhoods into its downtown, and it was buffered by plastic posts in this situation. Down to the left is Fell Street in San Francisco. It's in a more residential area, although there was also commercial, and it had some of the higher traffic volumes, close to 30,000 ADT. And it's a one-way protected bike lane with plastic posts in the buffer space on a one-way street. And then down and to the right is Cully Boulevard in northeast Portland, which is a two-way street with one-way protected bike lanes on either side. And this one facility was unique compared to the others. It's actually raised up a couple inches above the pavement, and it had on-street parking to also buffer the bike lane, but the parking wasn't occupied during the time of filming. Moving on to the reference sites, we have in the upper left corner Southwest Barber Boulevard, which is a major arterial road in Portland. And the sections I wrote 2 different sections of it. One section has an extra stripe in it to buffer the bike lane further from motor vehicle traffic. So I wanted to get an idea if that had an impact at all on bicyclists coming. Street in northeast Portland, and it's just a shared road with a wide space that allows on-street parking. Down to the left is a multi-use path, a spring water, so there's no motor vehicle traffic in this situation. This was to get an idea of how everything compared to a facility that's completely separated from traffic. Moving over to the right is Barber Boulevard in Portland, which has a standard bike lane. Down to the left is Ankeny Street, which is a bike boulevard. It has speed bumps, traffic diversion, and sharrows on the route. And over to the right is another section of Multnomah Street, which also has the protected bike lane. Eventually turns into this bike lane adjacent to on-street parking. For administering the survey, we had 2 different methods. We started off with an in-person survey. So for the in-person survey, we set up a room with chairs, a projector, external speakers on a computer, and played the clips in a continuous loop and recruited people to come in and watch the videos. Once in, they got in, sat down, got oriented, and they started off on their scoring sheet at whichever clip number came up next on the screen. And they watched all 20 clips that came up in the showing and rated each one for how comfortable they would feel if they were the bicyclist shown in that situation, using an A through F scale. So A, extremely comfortable, F, extremely uncomfortable. And we recruited people at 3 different locations. 2 were at the Portland Farmers Market on the Portland State campus. This was in November, so it was one of the only farmers markets still going in the area, so it attracted a range of people from all over the area. And we offered them an incentive of a farmers market token that they could use to spend out there in the farmers market if they participated. We did that twice, and then we did one at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry during their adult night, for lack of a better term for it. I forget what it's called exactly now. But it's a 21 and over event, so we didn't have the issue of having parents with kids in the area. And again, it's a unique place that draws a wide range of people from all over the area. So now I'm going to show you kind of an example of what we showed people. So I'm going to switch over to a video real fast that hopefully you'll be able to see just fine. All right, so that was an example of, we showed 20 videos similar to that one in each session. Hopefully you were able to hear some of the audio, but we did have an external speaker on our camera to catch the audio of it too, so people could not only just see what the bicyclists would see, but also hear it as well. And now I'll go over the results from that in-person survey, and we'll get to the online survey a little bit later. The online survey was done sort of secondarily just to compare what type of results you would get from an online survey as opposed to an in-person survey, and using different advertising methods. So our survey participants, to give you an idea of who actually took our in-person survey, we had slightly more women than men. And while the distribution skewed a little towards the younger side of things with many participants under the age of 40, we did have good representation from people who were in their 40s, 50s. We even had one or two people in their 80s take our survey. And so while, again, the skews younger, compared to other studies, this was a pretty good range of ages and gender mix. We asked people to let us know how often they rode a bicycle for different purposes. Previous studies have been a little biased towards people who ride regularly. And I was pleased to see with this particular study, we got a lot of people who don't ride regularly or sometimes even often. You'll see that people that ride every day or more, the smallest group here in the study, especially for commuting purposes. We have some people that ride more for recreation and other purposes, but again, we didn't get a lot of the hardcore bicyclists taking the survey, at least in person. To get an idea of how these demographics might have impacted our survey, we looked at whether or not they were correlated with the ratings. And so a positive correlation means people were less comfortable as that variable increased. So people who were older tended to be less comfortable in the same situation as a younger person. Females were slightly less comfortable than men, but that was not statistically significant. And people that rode less tended to be less comfortable in the different situations as well. We did a quick look at whether the scores that people provided for different types of facilities that were shown, and they came out roughly how we'd expect them to, with the off-street path being the most comfortable, followed by various protected bike lanes, the bike boulevard, and then standard bike lane and a shared street. The outlier here is the bike lane with parking. The issue with this one is it was just one site we had, and it was a relatively calm site, which goes to show how influential traffic volumes can be on standard bike lanes. Typically, we expect to see a bike lane with parking to be more up here with a regular bike lane. And then we looked at the score that people provided for the protected bike lanes by the different type of buffer. So what we found was that the planter buffer was by far the most comfortable, followed by the parked cars or that raised facility that had potential for parked cars next to it. And then plastic posts were the least comfortable of the different buffer types. Let's see, we looked at whether or not other factors had any impact on the final scores, and we generally found that motor vehicle volumes were significantly correlated with decrease in comfort. Not too surprising, as speeds or motor vehicle volumes go up, we had people felt less comfortable in the same situation. We found a similar effect as the road got wider or as more driveways and unsignalized intersections came into play. So for the final model development, I looked at a couple of different options. One was to look at a basic index table, which is a quick lookup table of if you could just take a look at a couple different factors, could you just look up and get a score for the facility that way? I wanted to see how effective that would be. And then I looked at mathematical regression-based models using both standard linear regression that we're all mostly familiar with, as well as a logistic regression model that I'll talk about later. The variables that I plugged into the mathematical models were the type of buffer, whether or not the bike lane was one-way or two-way in direction, the number of travel lanes, and the motor vehicle volume on an average daily traffic basis. I used ADT because that information is more readily available than the peak hour traffic in a direction, which is what's used in some other models. And I tried to use the number of travel lanes and motor vehicle volume interchangeably to see if they would have a different effect. Since wider roads tend to have a higher ADT, there is some sort of correlation there. So I wanted to see if that would work as a good substitute for areas where you don't have ADT volume readily available. So this shows you the three different models I looked at. They all include the type of buffer. They all include whether or not the bike lane is one-way or two-way. The first two models include the variables I said I had on the last slide there, the motor vehicle speed. One of them had number of motor vehicle lanes. The other one had the volume. Instead, as I said, they're using the substitutes. That third model you see on the right was a best fit model I let the software determine for me. And so you can see it added in a couple other factors. The motor vehicle volume in the adjacent lane is a slightly better predictor than the ADT of the road. And that model had a slightly better fit that way. So as I mentioned, these models used logistic regression, which has an advantage over standard linear regression that we're used to that gives you a single numerical value. Regression in this case produces a model that tells you the probability that someone will rate a particular facility with a particular score. So that can be interpreted as the percentage of your population that will view a facility in each score. So for instance, it could be telling you that, say, the majority, say up here for clip number 1, the majority of people would rate this as an A, another good portion would rate it as a B, and a slightly smaller percentage of the population rated as a C, D, or E, or F. So in this way, it gives us a good idea of what percentage of the population is served by the facility, and not just an average number. And as you look through here, what I'm showing in these graphs are how the three different models fit compared to what we actually observed for data. So the observed is at the top, model 1, 2, and 3 going up. And you'll see that they're relatively consistent between all the models and the actual observed data. In some cases, certain models fit a little bit better than others, but generally they all fit pretty well compared to the observed data. So from that, I'm recommending the use of that second model, which is your buffer type, one-way versus two-way traffic, motor vehicle speed, and ADT. It generally had the best fit compared to the other models and used data that's pretty readily available. So looking at what the different coefficients on the model are can tell you an idea of how each different factor impacts the likelihood that someone will rate a facility a certain way. So for instance, the reference facility for this model is a one-way protected bike lane with a plastic post buffer. So if you were to take that same road that it's based on and replace it with a parked car buffer, the odds that someone would rate it one level grade higher increase by close to 300%, and closer to 700% for a planter buffer. So in this regard, you can get an idea for the different impacts of each type of buffer, or a one-way versus a two-way facility. So a two-way facility is likely to be more negative, has on each one. Now, running parallel to this project was our lessons from the Green Lane project, where we were evaluating protected bike lanes in 5 different cities. As part of that study, we intercepted bicyclists on different protected bike lanes to ask them a number of questions. One of the questions we asked them was, how comfortable did you feel on your ride down this facility today? And so we have actual data then based on what people think who ride these. And so I wanted to compare the results from this model to how people actually perceived it, who actually rode it. So not just watching videos, but people who are riding these facilities regularly. In doing so, I also wanted to bring in the Danish level of service model to see how well it compared. It's a similar form as my model, but it's based on data from Denmark. And so I wanted to compare. So the top here is the observed, what we got from the actual surveys. The middle is the results from the Danish model, and the bottom are the results from my model. And what you'll see is that generally the model I developed for this project tracks what we actually observed from people in the field pretty well. The Danish model also does a good job, although it's missing oftest in a few locations. It could be due to demographics or other factors. I'm not sure exactly what it is. And the other thing about the results from this are that not all of these places where we intercepted people were places we showed videos of. For instance, Barton Springs Road in Austin, Texas was not included in my survey, and so it provides a nice little control to compare the results from my model to what people actually experience in the field. Similarly with L Street in Washington, D.C., or the section of Milwaukee Avenue that has parked cars. We only showed the section with posts before. And on these, we still see a good fit between the model and what's observed. So secondarily, I developed a little index table just to get a feel for, could you do this even quicker without even having to plug numbers into a model? What would your results look like? And so how this would work is you would look at these 4 features of the road you're looking at and consider what's the worst case for that road. So do you have a protected bike lane with planters with a motor vehicle speed of 25 miles an hour, but an ADT of 17,000 vehicles with 2 lanes? You would call that a B. Now, if it met all these criteria, though, it would be an A. And in comparing that index table to the actual scores that we observed from the study, it generally fit pretty well. It was off in a couple locations, just where it predicted a better score than what was actually seen from our data. And these were both on two-way facilities. And you'll note that two-way is not included in this index table. It just didn't work quite right in there. So it provides a reasonable approximation, though it's not quite as accurate or doesn't give you quite as much data as the actual mathematical model. Now, I'll talk a little bit about the online survey we did. This was administered differently than our in-person survey, which was meant to attract the general population. With the online survey, we said, what's going to happen if we go ahead and just send this out to the groups that are most likely to respond? So we used the social media from Portland State. I sent a link out to the survey via the Association of Pedestrian and Bicycle Professionals. Some of you may have taken the survey through that. And it went out through a number of advocacy groups and other organizations. And we got a pretty good return on that survey with very little effort apart from putting the survey online and sending out the links. But what we found was we got a different demographic, which is what we expected, compared to our in-person survey. We found that the online respondents tended to be older, on average by 7 years. It was significantly more male. Instead of being just under half of the population being male, almost 2/3 of the sample for the online survey were male. They also bicycled quite a bit more often. So we got more of the group that tends to show up at your typical, say, open house meeting for a bicycle-related project, where you've got your older males who bike pretty regularly checking in. And then controlling for the demographics, we wanted to get an idea of what is the actual effect of having people sit on a computer and watch the videos, tuning the audio themselves. You have no control over the quality of the screen they have, compared to an in-person survey where you control the audio, you control the video quality, you know what it looks like. And we generally found that people were a little less comfortable in were stating that they were less comfortable by about 1/4 point on average once you controlled for demographics using the online survey. So not not a giant difference, but a little bit of a difference that you want to keep in mind if you were to administer something online. So wrapping things up, I think moving forward, I think the way to go is to use the logistic model that I presented earlier. I didn't give you the full equation because it's daunting to look at, but it's implemented without too much trouble. It uses readily available data, and it works in has a valid range that I would consider it works well in based on the surveys that we did. So if you were to use it outside of these range, say on a road with more than 30,000 vehicles per day or on a low volume road, the results might be a little unreliable at that point. So it's limited to roads with speeds, moderate speeds, 25 to 35, and of certain buffer types. Kind of secondarily, we found that what we expected, protected bike lanes were generally more comfortable than other types of on-street infrastructure. The buffer type is a significant predictor of how comfortable people will feel. I think that's also matched up by experience, where we've talked to people who bicycled in protected bike lanes protected by parked cars or planters have said that they enjoy that experience more than when they ride just in the area protected by plastic posts. The one-way versus the two-way did matter. People did feel a little less comfortable on a two-way facility than they did on a one-way. Granted, in my video survey, it was just the two-way facility in downtown Chicago that was used. However, we received a number of open-ended comments of people saying, generally when I ride on a two-way, I feel less comfortable for these reasons, to both this survey as well as our other project survey. So even though it's based on a limited data set, I still think that finding holds based on other feedback we've received. Motor vehicle volumes are a significant factor in how comfortable people feel bicycling, and online surveys, especially if they're advertised differently, will produce different results than an in-person survey. So you want to consider how you advertise and conduct any type of survey like this. The limitations of the model go back to some of those valid ranges I showed earlier. It's limited to the types of protected bike lanes I was able to show videos of, which was limited just based on what I was able to get to and what exists out there today. The range of traffic conditions, it fits within that one range that I saw there. At the lower end of traffic, on a low volume street, it really doesn't hold up quite as well. Although I don't know if there's quite as much of a need to analyze those in detail. I think people generally feel comfortable on extremely low volume streets with a protected bike lane on them. The intersections are not included. That would be a great thing for a future study. That's an area that needs a fair amount of look, as many of you may be aware of. It's where the protection typically goes away on these bike lanes. So how we treat them at the intersections is a matter of ongoing discussion. The video production was done reasonably well, and I compared it to previous studies. The contractor on the HCM level of service was nice enough to provide me their videos they used, and mine compared, I thought, favorably towards theirs. Camera technology, that's largely because camera technology has come a long ways recently. But you still had some quirks there here and there from having me doing the video production instead of professional, such as I had a squeaky chain in a couple of videos that I wasn't able to filter that audio out. And then the sample demographics do skew a little young and a little more towards people who ride, although it's not too significant. Based on what I kind of saw with my validation effort, my opinion is that the model is ready for use within the identified ranges. It could be used to help you identify how well a protected bike lane within those ranges will serve the citizens of an area. And for future work, we'd like to see some more work done on intersections, seeing someone add them into a model. And we've got the current methods out there are missing different types of infrastructure, whether it's protected bike lanes or paint buffered bike lanes. And it would be good to see funding go towards creating a new overall method, somewhat similar to the HCM one, but it's a little more encompassing of different types of on-street infrastructure. So with that, I think we'll open it up to questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nick. And for those viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them. Just enter them into the questions pane that's on your screen. We do have a number of questions. So the first one is from Mike Hendricks. His question is, was a two-way protected bike lane adjacent to a two-way motor vehicle facility reviewed?
No, it was not. It was only next to a one-way motor vehicle facility.
Okay. The next one we have is from Sean Vienna. His is, how many Intercept surveys were conducted in your study?
Oh, for Intercept surveys from the other study, in total there was over 1,000 returned. So each site I showed earlier had over 100 responses for each site. For this particular study, I had over 200 people take the in-person survey.
Okay, great. And then from John Hicks, we have, how does this relate to the People for Bikes study?
So the People for Bikes study, I'm assuming you're referring to the Portland State study I also mentioned before. That was funded in part by well, we received some funding from the Green Lane project, which is run by People for Bikes. So the Intercept survey that I referred to earlier came from that project.
Okay, great. And then from Steve Coleman, when you say speed, do you mean the median mean speed or the 85th percentile speed?
I am using posted speed in this particular study for most of the facilities. Where we did have 85th percentile speeds available, they compared to the posted speed. So again, I'm trying to use data that's readily available, and typically that's the posted speed.
Okay. And then what about the relationship to the HCM? Steve writes in, will this method be included in the 2015 HCM update that's now in progress?
It's a good question. I don't think it will be included in the HCM update. It's not currently on the table there. I have submitted it to that committee at TRB, but I'm still awaiting the results of their review. So that's still all to be determined.
Okay. And then we have a question from Josh DeBrun. Do you think your results would be different if you included intersections in the analysis, not just segments?
I do. I think it would depend on the type of intersection treatment and how busy the intersection is. That's one thing that I think really could use some future work. We didn't have the time and resources, unfortunately, to include that in the study.
Okay, great. From Douglas Norval, was grade considered? Most of your examples seem to be level and absent of curves.
They were absent of curves. They were not level, though. The San Francisco videos, as you might imagine, were on an uphill grade, and so is Broadway Street in Portland. I didn't use it as a model factor. I don't think it would have been, I'm not sure if it would have been significant if I had, but some of the videos, though, were on an uphill grade. None of the protected bike lane clips were on a downhill grade. Some of those reference clips were on an uphill grade, too.
Okay. And then just a few questions that I have myself. So if someone wanted to use this method, what would they need to do? Is it practice ready?
So I think it is. And the way to do that would be, well, so this presentation doesn't have all the model coefficients, but I have that available in my thesis on the link, which should be available now on Portland State's website at the link shown here. And I would recommend contacting me to kind of talk through how you'd want to use it.
And then if you're a practitioner, how do you use it, like, from that perspective? So you've done some really good research, but how do you translate that into the practice?
So you'd use this as a part of an effort where you wanted to evaluate what types of different features, if you were set on a protected bike lane, you could use it at that design level to identify what types of impacts different features would have on the comfort of bicyclists riding that lane. If you wanted to compare it to different facility types, say you had a road that you weren't sure warranted a protected bike lane, you could try comparing the level of service you get from this model to what you get from, say, the HCM model and see how the different results compare.
Okay, and then you also talked about expanding this model to look at other facilities. So how would you go about doing that to modify your model to accommodate an analysis of more bicycling facilities, not just protected bike lanes?
So I think the in-person survey format that I used here and was used for both the HCM and the Danish level of service models works pretty well. It's compared favorably both in my study and in a Florida study to actual in-field results. And so I think doing a more comprehensive study of showing people a wider variety of different types of lanes to get that more encompassing model would be a good approach there. That's how they developed the Danish model. It was a pretty concerted and focused effort involving a lot of different facilities all in one setting.
Okay, great. So Josh does have a follow-up question to the initial question about intersections, including intersections in the analysis. So his question is, as a follow-up to the intersection question, in your opinion, would the comfort level go up or down?
It would go down in most cases. So I think that's just based on my own feeling riding through some of these areas.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes even you go from having your own space where you have some type of physical buffer to all of a sudden sharing a lane, and then where you have to be more aware of what's going on with oncoming with traffic that might be turning across the lane if you're not sharing. It might be in areas, say like downtown Chicago, where they use a signal phase to completely separate out the bike lane through movements from the turning motor vehicles. I'm not sure how much of an impact that would actually have on the overall rating. And when I rode through it felt pretty good just knowing you had that phase, although that may have also been because I was aware of how that all operated.
Right. All right, great. So a few more. Another question from Michelle Glickert. Do you think that the curb or elevated bikeway additional protection mattered in the study?
Let's see. Okay, so that the curb there, it did. I mean, it gave a favorable rating compared to, say, plastic posts with similar features. There were no parked cars in there at the time, and so what I would have been interested to have seen, had I been able to show more clips, would have been how the raised element compares to, with parked cars, compares to just a standard raised element or other features. I know anecdotally, some people really like the raised curb areas, and some people really don't. It seems to be, from talking with people, it seems to be one of the types of treatments that gives some of the more split discussions compared to some of these other treatments.
And does that also depend on like the type of cyclist too, or does that vary?
Well, I think for all of these, it varies a little bit by type of cyclist.
Okay.
With the raised element, though, it's what I've seen anyway. This is my own anecdotal experience, is that you still have some of the same really, the 2% strongest riders don't necessarily like the protected bike lanes because they feel like it cages them into an area where it's more difficult to pass other riders or to dart across the street to their destination, which is less of an issue with the race because they can jump on and off. But some people don't feel quite as comfortable knowing they have a curb on either side, and they don't like the idea of a drop-off.
Okay. We have one last question, and it's from Wayne Kittelson. You may be familiar with him. It sounds like the volume of bikes would also be a factor affecting the overall quality of service perceived by the bicyclist. Bike facilities exist today in the Portland area and probably elsewhere where bike volume potentially rises to this threshold. What are your thoughts on this, and how might it affect different treatment types, in your opinion?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks, Wayne. So, for instance, on Chicago and Milwaukee Avenue, they have thousands of bicyclists a day. And I did notice that when I was doing some of my ride-throughs, I didn't show the videos with all the bicyclists in it, fearing that would interfere with the actual measurements and bias it compared to other ones. It does feel a little less comfortable when you have a cyclist kind of coming all around you, if they're passing you, or if you're coming up to a large queue. So I'd expect you'd see, as facilities get more congested, there might be an interest in moving towards something that's more similar to the methods, older methods that were used from the Highway Capacity Manual regarding actual congestion measures. I know someone else at Portland State did a separate little study on the Hawthorne Bridge, which does get congested with bicyclists, especially during commute times in the summer, to identify how the different levels of congestion affected their level of service. But I have not asked her for the results of it yet.
Okay, great. So with that, I don't think we have any more questions. I wanted to thank everybody for tuning in today. And thank you, Nick, for taking the time to present your work. We're looking forward to your feedback so that we can continue to offer relevant webinars in the future. So be on the lookout for an email. And we'll be also in touch with information about the professional development credits. Just wanted to make a plug for an upcoming training that we have. We have a 1.5-day training session at the end of October on trail design. For more information, visit our website at www.pdx.edu/IBPI. Thanks again for tuning in.